Hey guys, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is for you. It's Friday for you guys. So I'm going to be going over the stuff that we're going to do next week, which is going to be right triangle trigonometry. So a right triangle, in case you have already forgotten, it's going to look like this. Okay. So we are going to be looking at the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And we're also going to be looking at the three trig functions, which are always going to be written using only the first three letters. It's going to be sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay? So those sound like really weird things, but on a calculator, they are just above the buttons. So you can see them, they're two spaces above the buttons, right there, sine, cosine, and tangent. So that's how we're going to get through this unit. If you don't have a calculator for next week, you better go get one, or you're not going to be able to do pretty much anything in the whole unit. Don't forget, next week is 2-hour early release, so that means we're going to have to be flying through a lot of stuff pretty quick. The next week will be a normal week, but we're going to have our test over trigonometry on Thursday. So then Wednesday will be a review day. So Monday and Tuesday will basically be review as well, because we're going to be able to cover pretty much the whole unit next week. But just be ready to not be in class for very long next week because of parent conferences. Okay, so when we're looking at a right triangle, you have to be able to label the sides in order to know which of the three trig functions you are trying to use. Okay, so I've drawn a bigger triangle. So the one side that is always going to get the same name, it's a word we've already used. It is the hypotenuse. Okay, the hypotenuse is always the longest side, and it is always directly across from the 90-degree angle. Now the other two sides depend on where your angle is. So I just put a circle with a line through it. That is the Greek letter theta. So that's what I'm going to be using to represent the angle measure that we have. Okay, so if we're using that angle, then this side over here is the opposite, because it is the side that is furthest away from the angle. And then our third side, the one that's down here, that would be labeled the adjacent side. So those are the three words that we're going to use a whole bunch to label our sides. So you've got hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. Okay, now I said that's if our angle is down there. If our angle is not down there, then the opposite and adjacent sides are going to switch. So I'm going to erase those names. I'm going to put theta up in that corner. Okay, so now if theta is up in that corner, now the adjacent side is over here, and the opposite side is on the bottom. So we have to be able to label the sides correctly, and the reason that is so important, as I said earlier, is so that we know which of the trig functions we're going to use. So those three trig functions, they are all part of their own equations. Okay, so sine, cosine, and tangent. So anytime you make an equation, the trig function is always going to have the angle right next to it. So in this case, again, I'm just using theta. We will typically have an angle measurement that we are going to use. But for now, I'm just going to use theta. Okay? That's the first half of the equation. Then we've got the equal sign. The second half of the equation is always going to be a fraction. For sine, it's going to be opposite over hypotenuse. So this is where we have to know those sides. Okay, so we've got to be able to label the sides correctly. That way we can put them into the correct equation. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So we've got sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So the short way to remember that, if you want a short way to remember it, you take the first letter of each word and you make this weird word at the bottom. SOHCAHTOA. If you've ever heard anybody say SOHCAHTOA before, this is what it's from. Trigonometry. Okay? So I'm going to be saying SOHCAHTOA a bunch. We're going to be writing down SOHCAHTOA a bunch because that's just the fast and easy way to remember sine, cosine, tangent, opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse, all of those fun things. Alright, so let's take a look at an actual example because there are 3 things that you can do with an equation. Okay, the reason there are 3 things is because we have an angle and 2 sides. So you have to solve, you're going to have to solve for one of them. Alright, now we're never ever going to use the 90-degree angle as our angle because that messes up everything. That throws off what would be the hypotenuse, what would be adjacent. We're never ever going to use the 90-degree angle. Nobody does. That's just a rule in math. You don't use the 90-degree angle as your angle. Okay, so we're going to say that the angle down there is 42 degrees. I'm just making this up. We are going to solve for the hypotenuse, and then we're going to say that the side on the bottom is 7. Okay, so again, I need to be able to correctly label my sides. So if I'm using the 42, that's the angle that I'm working with, then the 7 is adjacent and the x is the hypotenuse. So the 7 is adjacent and the x is the hypotenuse. So if I'm working with the adjacent and the hypotenuse, so CAH, C-A-H, I got the A and the H, so that means it's going to be cosine. So I'm going to make my equation, it's going to be cosine. What is my angle degree? It's 42. So 42 goes next to cosine. So cosine 42 equals, and then I'm going to do my fraction. It's A over H, opposite over adjacent. So that, adjacent over hypotenuse. A over H, adjacent over hypotenuse. Wow. Okay, so that's going to be 7 over x. So the x, what we are solving for, is the denominator of our fraction. So if you're solving for one of the sides, you need to remember this. If x is up high, you multiply. If x is down low, you switch and divide. What does the switch mean? Here's what the switch means. We're going to leave the 7 exactly where it is, but we're going to make the x and all of this, the cosine 42, they're going to switch places. So now x is on the left by itself, and 7 is over cosine 42. So that's what it's going to look like. And so 7 divided by cosine 42, that is exactly what we are going to put into our calculator. Okay, so 7. You do have the option, you can either just regularly divide or you can use the fraction button. It's not going to matter. So I'm just going to regularly divide cosine 42. So 7 divided by cosine 42. Okay, cosine is just 2 spaces above the number 8. We hit enter, and we get that right there. So we're going to say 9.42. Okay, 9.42, and that's it. That's the hypotenuse. We just solved for x. X equals 9.42. So that is the first example. That is if x is on the bottom. So let's take a look. What if the 7 and the x were switched? Okay, because if you did this with sine or tangent, you would still set up the fraction, and you're looking at where is x. If x is on the bottom, it doesn't matter if you're doing sine, cosine, or tangent. If x is on the bottom, you've got to switch them and then divide. So they all work the same way. It's just which one are you doing? So we said we're going to make 7 the hypotenuse this time, which means I have to switch some of my equation. Okay, so we've made 7 the hypotenuse. X is now the adjacent. It's still going to be cosine. We're not using the opposite side at all. And so we're still going to have cosine 42 as the beginning of our equation. But now, it's adjacent over hypotenuse. That's going to be x over 7. X over 7. And if you remember, just a couple minutes ago I said, if x is up high, you multiply. Okay, so how do you multiply? So we're going to take the 7 from the bottom and move it over here in front and multiply it with cosine 42. So it's just like if you had a regular equation and you had something in the denominator. How would you get it out of the denominator? You have to multiply it to the other side. So we're going to put the 7 in front of the cosine 42 and we're going to multiply it. So again, we're going to go to the calculator, 7, and then times cosine. Make sure you use the trig function. Can't tell you how many times people just want to go, well, 7 times 42 is a really big number. Yeah, it's not going to give you a really big number if you do it correctly. Okay? So 7 times cosine 42, that is 5.2. So for this one, x equals 5.2. So as you're working, if you're worried that you're not doing it correctly, a little trick or piece of advice that you can remember or write down if you want to, your hypotenuse has to be the longest side. So if you're solving for an adjacent side or the opposite side, and you're getting numbers that are bigger than your hypotenuse, yeah, you're doing it wrong. So make sure that you are at least aware that the hypotenuse is supposed to always be the longest side. Okay, the last thing, because we've done multiplying, we've done dividing, now we've got to do inverses. And so the way that's going to work is if we've got our triangle, we are only ever going to do the inverse of something if we are solving for the angle. So I'm going to put x up there this time. Alright, so we're solving for x, and I'm going to make us use tangent. So we're going to say we have the opposite and adjacent sides. So we're going to say this is 8 and this is 12. Alright, so we have the opposite and adjacent sides. We still have to label them correctly. Okay, so if the x is up here, opposite is all the way down there. So the 8 is going to be the opposite side, and the 12 is going to be the adjacent side. So we know we're going to use tangent. You always have to put the angle next to the trig function, even if you don't know the angle. So that means we are going to have tangent x. So we are going to have tangent x because that's what we're solving for. We're solving for the x. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent. So that's going to be 8 over 12. So the fraction looks totally normal, totally fine. But we don't know the angle. So in order to solve for the angle, we've got to do the inverse. Okay, so the inverse is anytime you give something a power of -1. That is called the inverse. In the calculator, it depends on what kind of calculator you have. For one of these nice TI-36X Pros, all you have to do is tap that trig function button twice. So for tangent, let me clear this out. Tangent, we're just going to hit it twice, so once and then twice. And there you go, it changed it so that the inverse now. Okay, after you have the inverse, for those of you who have a different calculator, you're more than likely going to have to hit the second button and then whatever trig function button you're using. So then the last thing we have to do, this looks kind of sloppy. Because we're doing the inverse, we're also swapping the x with the fraction. So that means in the calculator, we know what to do. We've already got our inverse in the calculator, and now we're going to take the fraction exactly how it said. I am going to use the fraction button this time. You don't have to. You can just use division. Alright, so this is what it should closely resemble. And then we hit enter, and that is our angle measurement. So that is 33.7. So x equals 33.7. So we were solving for the angle. We had the opposite and adjacent sides. We set up our equation, remembering SOHCAHTOA, opposite over adjacent. That's how we make our fraction. You always, always, always have to put the angle next to the trig function, whatever it may be. And then because we are solving for the angle, we've got to do the inverse. So that's the -1 power. And that means that the x is now going to come over here, and our fraction will go in parentheses. And then as long as you put it in the calculator correctly, you're going to get your answer. So that is the vast majority of the entire unit, and I've covered it in less than 17 minutes. So next week we will do the Pythagorean theorem on Monday, solving for each of the letters. If you remember what I said, the Pythagorean theorem is, or if you already know what it is, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you have to solve for a or b, it's going to be the same thing. If you solve for c, that will be a little bit different. C should be really easy to solve because then you just plug everything in exactly how it is. You are going to have some square roots thrown in there, obviously, because we've got everything being squared, so be prepared for that. So that's going to be Monday. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we're going to be going over sine, cosine, and tangent, each of them, because you've got to be able to use each of them. And then the next week will be mostly a lot of review. There is going to be a couple of other things because there are a lot of word problems that we're going to be doing with the right triangles. So I hope you guys have a good weekend, and go Wolfpack, beat Marietta.